My name is Sarah Nichols, and on a Tuesday night in October, my phone lit up while I was washing dishes. One notification, then another, then another. I dried my hands and picked it up. 43 voicemails, all from the same number, a number I hadn't heard from in 7 years, my mother's. I stood in my kitchen with water still dripping from my fingers, and I stared at that screen, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not love, not anger, fear, because 43 voicemails in one night don't mean someone misses you. They mean something has happened. And what I found out when I finally pressed play changed everything I thought I knew about the 7 years I'd spent in silence. Before I tell you what happened next, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if stories like this actually mean something to you. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one of them. I really do. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand what 7 years of silence actually costs before you can understand what broke it. I grew up in a house full of noise, not the good kind, the kind of noise that sits in the walls of a place long after the people who made it are gone, the kind you can still hear when everything goes quiet. My family was loud in the way that masked everything, loud at dinner, loud at holidays, loud in arguments that could shake the windows. We were a big family. Mom, Dad, 3 brothers, Derek, Paul, and Ryan, and me, the only daughter, the youngest by 4 years. You would think being the only girl would have made me special. It made me invisible. Not immediately, not in the obvious way. It crept up slow, the way a tide comes in, barely noticeable until suddenly you're standing in water up to your chest, wondering how you got there. My brothers were athletes, all 3 of them. Derek was a football star in high school who went on a partial scholarship. Paul wrestled and won 2 state championships and got his picture in the local paper. Ryan was the wild card, not as decorated as his brothers, but funny and magnetic in a way that made every room he walked into tilt slightly in his direction. I was a reader, a writer, the kid who got lost in books and came home with straight A's that sat on the kitchen table like objects nobody quite knew what to do with. And my dad would look at my report card and say, "Good girl," and flip it face down to continue watching the game. My mother was more complicated. She was a woman who had wanted a specific kind of life and had gotten a slightly different one, and had never fully forgiven the difference. She loved me. I believe that. But she loved me the way some people love things they don't fully understand, at a slight distance, with a kind of cautious unfamiliarity, like she wasn't sure I was quite what she'd ordered. What she understood was my brothers. What she understood was sports and noise and boys who needed feeding and managing and celebrating. What she didn't understand was a daughter who sat in the corner of family gatherings reading Steinbeck and felt more comfortable in silence than in the center of things. So she did what people do when they don't understand something. She criticized it. My hair, my posture, my clothes, my friends, the few I had, my choice of books, the fact that I didn't play sports, didn't chase boys the way she expected, didn't perform my femininity in the particular way she'd scripted in her head. It was relentless. Not cruel in the dramatic movie way, cruel in the dripping faucet way. Small, constant, exhausting. I was 15 when I first heard the phrase, "You're too sensitive," used to end a conversation I was trying to have about my own feelings. I was 17 when I realized that phrase was just a way of saying, "Your feelings are inconvenient, please remove them from my sight." I spent my entire childhood being too something, too quiet, too serious, too in my head, too much somehow, or while also never quite being enough. I left for college at 18, and something in me exhaled for the first time in years. I went to a school 5 hours from home, and I studied English and creative writing, and I found people who spoke the same language as me. Not literally, but in the way that matters, in the way that means when you say something real, they hear it. I started writing, not for class, for myself, stories that lived in notebooks, stacked under my dorm bed that I never showed anyone. Stories about families and silence and the specific grief of growing up in a place that should have felt like safety but didn't. I called home every Sunday out of obligation. The calls lasted 10 minutes. My mother talked about my brothers. My dad watched TV in the background. I listened, said the right things, hung up and sat on my bed, feeling hollow and not entirely sure why. This went on for 4 years, and then I graduated and moved to Portland and started a life that was finally, genuinely mine. I got a job at a small publishing house as an editorial assistant. Tiny salary, massive love for the work. I had a studio apartment with a window that let in good light and a bookshelf that took up an entire wall and a cat named Boris who had opinions about everything. I had friends, real ones, the kind who show up, and I had for the first time a growing awareness that the constant low hum of inadequacy I'd carried since childhood was not a fixed feature of my personality. It was something I had absorbed from somewhere, and I was starting to set it down. The calls home got shorter, then less frequent. My mother noticed. "Ah, you never call," she said one Sunday. "I called last week, Mom, for 8 minutes. I was busy. Your brother Derek calls every 3 days, for an hour." I held the phone and stared at my bookshelf and said nothing. "I just think," she continued, "that you could make more of an effort." More of an effort. I had spent 22 years making every possible effort. "Mom, I'll call more," I said, and I hated myself slightly for saying it. The real breaking point didn't come from my mother. It came from a Christmas. I was 25. I drove the 5 hours home for the holidays because I still believed in the stubborn, hopeful corner of my heart that maybe this year would be different. It was not different. The house was the same chaos, my brothers and their girlfriends, and my aunts and uncles, the table that was too small for everyone, and the noise that was too big for the house, and my mother in the center of it all, bright and busy and warm in the way she could be when she was performing her best self for company. I helped in the kitchen, I set the table, I did the things I'd always done. At dinner, my Uncle Frank asked around the table what everyone was working on. Derek talked about his job in construction management. Paul talked about a new gym he was opening. Ryan made everyone laugh with a story about a disastrous camping trip. The girlfriends spoke. My father talked about the car he was restoring. Then Frank looked at me. "Sarah, what about you?" I said, "I'm working on a manuscript actually, a novel." "Oh, and my boss is letting me take on some of my own editing projects now." "A novel," my mother said from across the table. Her voice had that particular tone, the slight upward lift that made everything into a gentle ridicule. "She's always writing, since she was a little girl, filling up notebooks." She said it the way you'd say she's always chasing butterflies, fond, slightly, but fundamentally not serious. "That's wonderful," Frank said genuinely. "What's it about?" I opened my mouth. "She won't tell you," my mother said, laughing. "She never talks about it. Very mysterious, our Sarah." She turned to Paul's girlfriend. "Have you tried these potatoes? I made them with rosemary this year. I think it makes all the difference." And just like that, I was gone again, mid-sentence, mid-thought, removed from the conversation like a channel being changed. I sat with my fork in my hand, and I felt with perfect clarity something I had felt 1,000 times before. This specific erasure, this being talked past, talked over, talked around, and I felt something shift underneath it this time. Not sadness. Resolve. I drove back to Portland 2 days later, and I sat in my apartment with Borges in my lap, and I thought very carefully about what I wanted, what I needed, not what was expected, not what was family traditional or culturally obligatory, what I actually needed to be okay. And the answer came quietly but firmly. I needed distance, real distance, not the kind I'd been managing with short phone calls and annual visits. I mean the kind where you stop arranging yourself around the space other people haven't left for you. I wrote my mother a letter. Long and careful, not angry. I tried very hard for it not to be angry. I told her how I had felt, how I'd always felt, the erasure, the comparisons, the years of too sensitive and sideways comments and being the family footnote. I told her I loved her, and I told her I needed space to figure out who I was without the constant undertow of feeling like not enough. I sent it by email because I knew if I heard her voice, I would lose my nerve. She called 12 times that night. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail on the 12th call. Her voice was not sad, it was sharp. I don't know what I ever did to you, Sarah. Your father and I have given you everything. Your brothers would never do something like this. If you need your little space, fine, but don't expect me to understand it. She did not say, I hear you. She did not say, I want to understand. She said, your brothers would never. I put my phone in a drawer and I went no contact. 7 years is a long time. I want you to understand what 7 years actually looked like, because people hear no contact and they picture silence like a clean room, neutral, empty, peaceful. That's not what it is. 7 years is your mother's birthday in March every year, and you knowing she exists and choosing not to call. 7 years is Christmas with friends who are family by choice around a table that's warm and loud in all the good ways, and still, a thread of something pulling at you from a direction you used to call home. 7 years is the question strangers ask at dinner parties. Do you have family here? And the little internal calculation that happens before you answer. 7 years is wondering in the 3 a.m. hours if you made the right call. But it's also 7 years of becoming. I finished the novel. I found an agent. The book sold. Not to a huge house, but to a good one, a respected independent press that cared about the writing. It came out in the spring of my 29th year, and it got reviewed in 3 publications, and a book blog with a readership of 60,000 people called it quietly devastating and completely necessary. My mother didn't know the book existed. I started therapy, real, committed, twice a week for 2 years therapy that cracked me open and put me back together with better architecture. I learned words for things I'd felt my whole life without vocabulary. I learned the difference between guilt and responsibility. I learned that protecting yourself is not the same as punishing someone else, even if they experience it that way. I fell in love. His name was Thomas, a landscape architect with kind hands and a laugh that started slow and built into something enormous. He knew everything about my family from the beginning. I had learned to be honest early, to not carry it like a secret that might come out later and change everything. He listened to all of it without flinching. Do you miss them? he asked once, about a year into our relationship. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "Well, I miss the idea of them," I said. "I miss what they could have been. Does that make sense?" He nodded. "More than you know." We moved in together after 2 years. We got a house with a yard that he immediately destroyed with love. Turned the whole back garden into something that looked like a painting. I had a study with a window and a second bookshelf, and Borges, now elderly and imperious, claimed the armchair in the corner as his sovereign territory. I was happy, not the performed happiness of someone convincing themselves. Real, built, from scratch, chosen every day, happy. And then October arrived, and my phone screen lit up. I need to tell you something about how I found the voicemails. I had kept my mother's number in my phone all 7 years, not because I intended to use it, but because I needed to know when she was calling, so I could choose not to answer. If I deleted the number, she'd become an unknown caller, and unknown callers I might accidentally pick up. So her name was still there, 7 years, just sitting in my contacts like a sealed room. When the notifications came, I almost turned my phone face down and went to bed. 43 voicemails. I don't know why I didn't. Something told me this was different. Something in the sheer volume of it. The velocity. You don't leave 43 voicemails because you're angry. You leave 43 voicemails because you're desperate. I sat down on the kitchen floor and I pressed play on the first one. My mother's voice, 7 years older than the last time I'd heard it, slightly thinner, something behind it I hadn't heard before. Sarah, it's Mom. I need you to call me back. I know it's been a long time and I know you have every reason not to, but I need you to call me. Please." I pressed play on the second. "It's me again. I know you might not listen to these. I'm going to leave them anyway. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago and didn't, and I need you to know. Please call me." The third. "Sarah." A pause. Long enough that I thought the message had ended. "Your father is in the hospital." I stopped breathing. "It happened this afternoon. It's his heart. The doctors are doing what they can. I'm in the waiting room. I have your brothers here, but I keep thinking about you. I keep thinking I can't sit in this waiting room and not at least try to tell you. So I'm trying. Please." I played the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. She kept calling every 10 minutes, sometimes less. Sometimes she had an update, sometimes she just said my name and went quiet. By the 15th message, her voice had lost its composure completely. By the 20th, she was crying in that raw way that has no performance in it. By the 35th message, something had happened. "He's out of surgery. He's stable. They say he'll need months to recover, but he's going to be okay. He's okay." A long breath on the recording. "Sarah." And then something I had never, in my entire life, heard my mother say to me. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry for so many things. I don't deserve you to call me back, but I'm asking anyway. Because I have been sitting in this waiting room for 6 hours, thinking about how much time I have wasted being the kind of mother you needed to get away from. And I can't sit here with that and say nothing." Message 36. "I read your book." I stopped the playback, sat completely still on my kitchen floor. Borges padded in from the other room and sat in front of me instead, the way cats do when they sense disruption. "I read your book," she said again on the recording. "All of it, in one night, about 3 months ago. Ryan found it somewhere and he left it on my kitchen table and didn't say a word. I didn't even know you'd written a book. I didn't know. And I read it, and Sarah," her voice broke completely, I know it's not entirely fiction. I know who that mother is. And I know who that little girl is. And I've been carrying it for 3 months and not knowing how to call you. And then tonight, your father... She stopped, composed herself, barely. Tonight, I decided that I am done being too scared to do the hard thing. I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time. Thomas came downstairs. He took one look at my face and sat down on the floor beside me without a word. I handed him the phone. He listened to several messages. Then he set the phone down and put his arm around me, and we sat there together in the kitchen while the refrigerator hummed and the clock on the wall counted forward, and I felt absolutely everything and nothing all at once. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked. The same question people who love you ask when they know it's not their answer to give. I need to think," I said. "Okay, I need to think for a few days." "That's fair." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and I listened to my father's heartbeat in my imagination, steady, stubborn, going on. And I thought about what it means to be a person who spent 7 years building a life worth having, and whether that life had room in it for what had broken. What I had to hold very carefully in my mind was this. My father was stable. He was going to recover. This was not an emergency that required an immediate response. This was instead a moment. A door I didn't expect to see swing open. And I had to decide slowly and honestly what I wanted to do about it. I listened to all 43 voicemails over the course of 2 days, not consecutively, in pieces. When I had the emotional capacity for it, I took notes, which felt clinical but kept me from drowning in it. I wrote down the things my mother said that felt real, and the things that still, even now, felt like performance. I was not going to let the emergency of the moment paper over 7 years of clear-eyed truth. My therapist, I still saw her, monthly, less intensively than before, had an opening on Thursday, and I took it. I sat in that familiar chair and I said, "My mother left me 43 voicemails in one night. My father had a heart attack. She said she read my book and she's sorry, and I don't know what to do with any of it." My therapist, her name was Dr. Anand, she had silver-streaked hair and a very good poker face, looked at me for a moment and said, "What do you feel?" "Everything," I said. Simultaneously. "Can you name the things?" I tried. "Grief. For the years, for the father I might have had more time with if things had been different, for the childhood I deserved. Fear. Of being pulled back into the undertow of old dynamics, of losing the self I had worked so hard to build. A strange, tender, fragile thing that might have been hope, but felt too early to name. And underneath all of it, anger. Not the burning kind, the cold, patient kind that lives in you when you've been waiting 7 years for someone to see what they did and say something real about it. What would need to be true, Dr. Anand asked, for you to consider re-engaging? I thought about it for a long time. That it's not just the crisis talking, I finally said. That she's not just scared right now, and reaching out, and then, once Dad is fine and the fear passes, going back to who she was. I need it to be real. "And how would you know if it's real?" "I guess," I said slowly, "I'd have to give it a chance to show me." I drove to my hometown on a Saturday morning. Thomas offered to come. I told him no. This was something I had to do by myself. This was between me and the people I came from, and I needed to stand in it alone so I could know, after, exactly what I felt. The drive was 5 hours. I listened to nothing. No music, no podcasts, just road and sky and the inside of my own head, which was busy enough. My father was home from the hospital. 2 weeks post-surgery. He was recovering at my parents' house, which was the same house I grew up in, which I had not entered in 7 years. I parked in the driveway. I sat in the car for 4 minutes exactly. I know it was 4 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard. Then I got out. My mother opened the door before I reached it. 7 years older, smaller somehow than I remembered. Her hair had gone almost entirely grey, which surprised me because she had always fought it so hard. She was wearing a cardigan I didn't recognize, and she looked like a woman who had been through something. She looked, for the first time in my memory, uncertain. Not performing, not managing, uncertain. We stood on the front step, looking at each other. "You came," she said. "I came," I said. A pause that lasted a long time. "Your father's in the living room. He doesn't know you're... I didn't tell him." Out in case... She stopped. Her jaw tightened. In case you didn't come. She had protected him from the possibility of my not coming. I noticed that. I walked inside. The house was the same and completely different in the way things are when you've been away long enough for your memory of them to become its own separate thing. The smell was the same. The particular creak of the third floorboard in the hallway. The light through the kitchen window at that specific angle. My father was in the armchair by the window, thinner than I'd ever seen him. The surgery had taken something visible out of him, and the recovery was putting it back slowly, but not yet. He had a blanket over his lap, and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and a paperback on the side table that he'd clearly fallen asleep over. He heard me come in. He opened his eyes, and for just a moment, before he had time to compose his face into anything else, I saw pure surprise. And behind the surprise, relief. "Sarah," he said. His voice was rough from being used less than usual, from the hospital and the medications and the quietness of recovery. "Hi, Dad." I sat in the chair across from him. My mother hovered in the doorway for a moment, and then, something I didn't expect, she left, just quietly withdrew, left the two of us alone in that room. My father looked at me for a long time. "You look good," he finally said. "You look like someone who scared us all," I said. He laughed. Short, slightly careful, like it still hurt to use his whole chest. "Yeah, that's fair." A silence. Not uncomfortable, exactly. A heavy with everything neither of us had said in 7 years, but not hostile. More like two people standing at the edge of a body of water they both know they have to eventually cross. "I'm glad you're okay," I said, and I meant it fully, without complication. Whatever else existed between us, this man was my father, and I had been afraid for him, and I was glad he was sitting in that armchair with his reading glasses on his forehead. His eyes got wet. He didn't look away. "I should have called you myself," he said, "years ago. I should have. Your mother handled most of it, and I let her, and that was wrong. I'm not blaming her for my part in it. I could have picked up the phone any time." "Yes," I said, "you could have." He nodded, accepted it, without deflecting. That was new. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what that cost you? For what it cost us?" I looked at my father. This man who had always been more comfortable on the sideline of emotional life than in the middle of it, who had expressed love through presence rather than words, who had loved me in the limited way he knew how, and had not known how to do more. And I felt, with tremendous clarity, the difference between forgiving someone and excusing them. You can forgive a person their limitations. You can love someone at whatever distance is honest. You can choose to rebuild something without pretending the original was fine. "Tell me what you've been doing," he said. "All of it. I want to hear." So I told him. I found my mother in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter with her back to the door, very still, not cooking, not doing anything. Just standing. She heard me come in, and she turned around. Her eyes were already red. "Can we sit down?" I said. We sat at the kitchen table. Same table, same chairs, the same window. I had eaten 10,000 meals at this table and felt invisible at most of them. I had rehearsed nothing. I had decided, on the drive over, to let the conversation find its own shape, rather than try to control it. "I read your letter," she said. "The one you sent 7 years ago. I read it again last week. I read it 3 times. I hadn't expected that. I was defensive when I first read it," she said. "You know that. You probably knew I would be. I called you all those times and I said what I said." She paused, looked at her hands on the table. "It took me a long time to stop being defensive and read it. Really read it. Years. Ah, Sarah, I'm ashamed it took me that long." "What changed?" I asked. "The book," she said, quietly, directly. "Ryan left it on my table in July and didn't say anything. I think he did it on purpose. He always understood more than he let on." A small, sad, almost smile. "I read it in one night. I couldn't stop. And when I finished, I sat with it, and There's a scene near the end, the daughter and the mother at the kitchen table, where the mother realizes she's been looking at a stranger she raised. Do you know the scene I mean?" I knew the scene. I wrote it at 2 in the morning 3 years ago. I wrote it in one draft and never changed a word. "I know the scene," I said. "Is that us?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. I looked at her for a long moment. "It was," I said. "I don't know what we are right now." "And I think that's what today is about." She nodded. Her hands moved on the table like she wanted to reach across and was asking herself if she had the right. "I was not a fair mother to you," she said. "I didn't know how to. You were different from what I expected, and I turned that into a criticism of you when it should never have been. You were wonderful. You were reading at 4 years old. Did you know I used to brag about that to anyone who would listen when you were little? Before I got afraid of it." She stopped. "Before I got afraid that if you were too different, you'd leave, which is what happened anyway, because I pushed you out instead of letting you go." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird, a car passing. "Why were you afraid of me leaving?" I asked. She looked up. "Oh, because you were the only thing I made that I didn't fully understand. Your brothers, I knew exactly who they were, what they needed, how to love them. With you, I was always slightly guessing, and I got it wrong so many times. And instead of admitting that I turned it around. I made you the problem." I sat with that for a moment. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," I told her. Her eyes spilled over. "I know. I didn't move to hug her. I wasn't ready for that, and I was going to be honest about what I was ready for. But I reached across the table, and I put my hand over hers. This is not me saying everything is fine," I said. "I need you to hear that. 7 years is real. What happened before those 7 years is real." I'm not going to sit here and fold all of that into nothing, because Dad had a scare, and you're sorry. She nodded, still crying, not flinching from what I was saying. "But I'm here," I said, "and that means I'm willing to find out if something real can be built from here. That's what I can offer today." She turned her hand over under mine and held on. "That's enough," she said. "That's so much more than I deserve." We sat at that kitchen table for 2 more hours. We talked, really talked, not the performed surface version, the underneath version, things I'd felt and she'd felt, and the space between what was intended and what landed. She cried 3 more times. I cried once, toward the end, when she told me she kept a copy of my book on the nightstand now and had read it twice more since July. It wasn't fixed. 1 afternoon doesn't fix 7 years, but it was something I hadn't had before. A foundation, something you could, if you were careful and honest and patient, start to build on. I drove home as the sun was going down, 5 hours back through the dark with the windows cracked slightly and the night air coming in and my mind quieter than it had been in days. Thomas was awake when I got home. He had made dinner and kept it warm, and he asked me nothing until I was ready to talk. I told him everything. He listened with his whole self, the way he always did, the way I had learned over years to recognize as genuine and not just practiced. When I finished, he said, "How do you feel?" Like I walked back into a burning building and found out most of the fire was already out, I said. And that some of it I brought with me. He tilted his head. What does that mean? It means some of my anger was keeping me warm as much as it was keeping me safe. It means that when I actually sat down with her, some of what I thought I needed the distance to protect me from, she'd already been doing the work of examining. Not all the way, not perfectly, but some of the way. Does that change how you feel about the last 7 years? I thought about it. No, I said. I needed every one of them. I needed to become myself without them in the room, but I think maybe the next 7 years can be different. He reached across the table and took my hand. Okay, he said simply. Then they will be. My father made a full recovery over the following months, slower than he wanted. He was not a patient. The irony, he said, of being a man who spent his whole life avoiding sitting still, being forced into a chair for 6 weeks. He called me once a week during his recovery, short calls at first, both of us finding our footing, longer, gradually. He started asking about my writing, about Thomas, about what I was working on. One day he called and said, out of nowhere, "I read part of your book. Your mother had it on the table. I read maybe 50 pages. What did you think?" A long pause. "I think you're more talented than I ever told you," he said, "and I'm sorry about that. I should have told you every day." I held the phone and breathed through it. "Thanks." Dad. "I'm going to finish it this week." "Okay. I might need to call you after." "I'll answer." My mother and I moved slowly, deliberately, not rushing the repair job, not plastering over cracks and calling them filled. She started sending me emails, not about my brothers, but about herself, books she was reading, a pottery class she'd started, a story about her own mother that she'd never told me before that explained quietly and incompletely, but honestly, some of the shape of who she'd become. I wrote back. We talked on the phone every 2 weeks. Sometimes it was easy, sometimes we still hit the old patterns and had to catch ourselves, had to slow down, had to say, wait, can we go back to that? My brother Ryan, the one who had left the book on her table, called me out of the blue in January. You owe me, he said. I know, I said. He laughed that enormous building-filling laugh. I'm just glad you came back. We were not the same family we'd been before. We were something new, something more deliberate, something that had to be chosen rather than assumed, and honestly, that was better. Here's what 43 voicemails taught me. Sometimes the people who hurt you are not evil. Sometimes they are just frightened, limited. People who received a version of love that was also incomplete and passed that incompleteness on without ever examining it. That doesn't absolve them. It doesn't mean you have to stand in the damage and call it a home. But it means the story can be more complicated than villain and victim. It means there is sometimes a chapter after the silence. I want to say this carefully though, because I know some of you listening have your own silences, your own no contact, your own blocked numbers and careful distances. What I chose is not a prescription. Every story is different. Some people leave because coming back would genuinely harm them. Some no contact is not a chapter, it's the ending. And that is valid. That is sometimes the most self-loving thing a person can do. What I learned from my particular story is this. The distance I kept was not a failure. The 7 years were not wasted.
They were necessary. They were the incubation period for the person I had to become in order to walk back into that kitchen and sit across from my mother as an equal and tell her the truth without either needing her approval or wanting to destroy her.
You cannot do that work while you're still inside the wound. Sometimes you have to go far enough away to see the shape of the thing clearly, and then if the door opens, if the person on the other side has done something real with the time, if your heart has the room and the strength, you can choose to walk back through, not to the same room, to a new one you build together. The 43 voicemails weren't a manipulation. They were a woman sitting in a hospital waiting room understanding for the first time the actual cost of the life she'd lived. And they were enough, not because they fixed everything, but because they were honest. And sometimes, after a very long silence, honesty is the bravest thing anyone can offer. I'm Sarah Nichols. 7 years ago, I protected myself by going silent. This past October, 43 voicemails arrived in one night, and I had to decide if I was going to stay silent or say something back. I said something back. I'm glad I did. And if you're somewhere in a silence of your own right now, on either side of it, I hope this story gave you something to think about. Protecting yourself is not the same as giving up. And choosing to rebuild is not the same as pretending nothing broke. Both things can be true. Both things are true. And you get to decide which chapter you're in.